when it comes to kind of, I guess the phrase I would use is playing to, or teaching to the test.
Right.
What is the danger that you see for those organizations that are adopting that are going out for that for their cyber and tech coverage, and what is the right, I guess, what approach would you recommend they take inside of that for themselves as a precursor to getting engaged with a third party that might specialize in that kind of a relationship?
It's a good question because while I've said many times in our discussions that I caution everybody to not use their insurance application as a means of setting controls or checking the box. For MSPs, it is a good way to look at sort of the high level requirements because, and rightly, they've been focused on PAM particularly, which is something that I think we all would agree for MSPs is a really important component and one that I think is still being explored and understood by that community. And so I think that that's one area. But again, like we talk about, that's sort of the beginning of defense in depth, right? Because those are the areas where then we can start to segment beyond that. But privileged access, privileged escalation, those are the areas that we know are the most dangerous. And so we are seeing again another rash of credential stuffing as a means of attempting to attack, and they are again becoming successful. And so part of what we know with the supply chain attacks where they're attacking manufacturing or MSPs, right? Where similar architecture, that we have to be very, very careful about the way we're doing implementations in those environments, to think very closely about how quickly can they spread and how do we quarantine particular attacks rapidly and identify them rapidly. And so it's PAM, it's mean time to detection, mean time to remediation, and of course segmentation. Those are the four most important ones that we're seeing. And that applies to healthcare too, because you could swap them out almost interchangeably in terms of what those risks look like and how they all kind of sit in the same risk bucket when carriers look at it, because they see the potential sort of massive and quick infection rate that spreads across an organization.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that correlation between those two types of organizations is really interesting. And also, it's not surprising to me that insurers relate those two because, in the world of incident response and breaches that affect organizations like that, just like an MSP, a healthcare organization is kind of a multi-headed beast, right? Like they have so much PII, so much PHI, and so many different systems because of the nature of what they do. They have to kind of think about it the same way, and that kind of goes back to what we were talking about with how MSPs need to think of themselves not as a small business, even if they are a small business from a staffing and revenue perspective, but from a risk perspective, they really do kind of have more of a need for a layered and intelligent approach. So, Kirsten, I guess inside of the insurability conversation, um, what are there any trends? Are there any, I guess, common steps that those MSPs are taking? You mentioned privilege access. You mentioned a number of other things in the response that you just provided. But where should they go? What should they do? What types of non-technical exercises could they engage in to kind of prep them for some of those larger undertakings?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, one certainly is even tabletop exercises, right? The pen testing, which is technical but useful, right? To make sure that there aren't other holes that they aren't seeing or thinking about. But the tabletop exercises are important. We do actually see a lot of MSPs who aren't entirely prepared for incidents, and either for their customers or for themselves. And so really getting focused on those fire drills, I think is an important feature for them to think about, and also to be doing with their customers, because people still click on links and some of those links are still bad. And so it's really prioritizing and identifying the best way to work through an incident. And I would say that for many MSPs are making this transition, as they should be, to offering larger security packages. And for a long time, they were infrastructure people. And so they need to make that transition and thinking more broadly about what does that incident response look like for a much larger infrastructure than just a very segmented piece. Backups were hit, or availability. I work a lot with organizations that were copier companies, so they have a really strong and big footprint there, and are spreading into IT management and security as managed services are starting to evolve. So you have a lot of organizations who are big organizations who are really starting to change their profile and need to think differently about how they manage their customer base than they have before. And that's a transition that they're going through and thinking very strategically about. So I think they deserve credit for it as well. But that's one area I think to start.
Yeah, no, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think a lot of MSPs have never even thought about doing a tabletop, and most, I wouldn't say most, many do not have any sort of incident response plan that's actually actionable. And just like I often tell folks when they're talking about or asking about their disaster recovery and business continuity plans, if you haven't tested it, what you have is a theory. You don't have an actual workable plan that you know will function in the way that you need it to when the bad thing happens. And so whether you're talking about the steps that you need to take to triage initially, to contain, to retake control or eradicate that threat actor influence on one or many assets, knowing how and what you need to recover, having an immutable backup strategy, and ensuring that that is aligned with kind of all those other life cycles of activity that could come up during an incident. Really, that whole conversation becomes a conversation not just about incident response, but about being resilient as an organization from a cyber perspective. And kind of going back to the Marsh report, I think that's the eye-opening moment I think a lot of folks in this industry have been having in the last 12 to 18 months, realizing with many of the studies that have come out proving this empirically with data, that cyber hygiene and effective uh, effectively implemented security architectures actually make not only a difference, but can often put you in a position where you can contain and respond to things that would ordinarily escalate and get very bad or be some kind of a nightmare scenario before they ever have an opportunity to do that. But the only way to do that is to do what you mentioned, align with controls. Don't play to the test, play to the framework. Go through those tabletops, think about those practical questions before you're in the trenches, and then walk through it all with folks that really know how to secure those type of kind of multifaceted, more enterprise like risk profile organizations like MSPs.